Tonight I'd like to speak about the connection between mindfulness meditation and compassion. Because often people think of meditation as being only a solitary endeavor, that we help ourselves through the meditation and then indirectly we help everybody else. But mindfulness in the service of wisdom, when we use mindfulness for the development of wisdom, is also the key to compassionate action in the world. And it's said that when both wisdom and compassion are both present and developed, enlightenment is unavoidable. So these are like the two great wings of Buddha Dharma, wisdom and compassion. So over the past few days we've discussed a lot about the wisdom aspect of the mind. Exploring the empty, insubstantial, impermanent nature of all our experience. So this evening we'll talk more about the compassion side. The Buddha emphasized compassion in many different places in the teachings. As you know, it's one of the four of what are called the Brahma Viharas, those four immeasurable states of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. So every time the Buddha talked about the Brahma Viharas, compassion is included. It's compassion that actually motivated the Buddha to start teaching. The story goes that after his enlightenment, on the morning of his enlightenment, he kind of looked around, and his first inclination, as it said, was, this will be too difficult for people. It's not worth the effort to try to explain it. But then, again, this is the story, the great Brahma god came down and said, there are people with but little dust in their eyes. That's us. Please teach for their benefit. And so the Buddha surveyed the world, and what motivated him, as the story goes, to begin teaching was he saw so many people wanting happiness, seeking happiness, and yet doing the very things, performing the very actions which brought about suffering out of ignorance. And he was moved by compassion then to start teaching. Compassion is also a prominent feature of the second step of the Eightfold Path. Starts with right understanding, and then the second step is called, in English, different translations, right intention, right aspiration, right thought. And it includes the development of those mind states of renunciation, of metta, loving kindness, and of compassion. That is, mind states free of desire, free of ill will, and free of cruelty. So here the difference between skillful and unskillful mind states is very obvious when we contrast the mind state of cruelty, which wishes harm to people, wishes harm to beings. That's the nature of cruelty. Whereas compassion wishes to alleviate the suffering of beings. So there's a very clear and easy understanding of the difference here between what's unwholesome and what is wholesome. When we hear the word cruelty, we might think that this is, a potential of the mind, but it's really quite rare in the world. But when we look around, watch any news program or read any newspaper, we see that this mind state of cruelty is motivating so many actions in the world. All the warfare, all the violence is all an expression of this mind state. And sometimes it's almost as if it seems infectious. You probably remember the times of when whole populations seem to be infected. It's like a virus of cruelty. You know, the killing fields in Cambodia, and then in Rwanda, and in Darfur, and so many places in the world, where whole populations get caught up. Where does it start? It starts in the mind. And it starts in the mind filled with this quality of wishing harm. You know, we see it in the destruction of so many native cultures around the world. We see it in violence against women in so many places in the world, of homophobia, of racism. So this is not an insignificant force in the world, this force of cruelty, of wishing harm. But there is also a powerful antidote to this very harmful mind state, and that is the quality of compassion. Because compassion is that very strong wish to alleviate the pain and the suffering in ourselves and of others, to bring suffering to an end. Compassion, when that's developed in us, it opens our hearts to the suffering that is there and overcomes our indifference to it. And indifference to suffering, we might think of that as a subtle form of cruelty. You know, it's not overt, but we're simply not open to and responsive to the suffering that's there. The Dalai Lama kind of captured, in a way, he both manifests this quality to an exemplary degree. He said, compassion and love are precious things in life. They are not complicated. They are simple, but difficult to practice. And I find that very interesting. You know, that they're precious things in life, love and compassion. They're not complicated, they're simple, but they are difficult to practice. So it's worth considering, I think, why such beautiful and ennobling states, qualities, why are they difficult to practice? One would think they bring so much joy, so much happiness to ourselves and others. Shouldn't it be easy? So it's worth exploring why they're difficult to practice. Compassion arises out of our willingness to come close to suffering. The problem is that we may wish to be compassionate, and perhaps often are. But as you know, just from these last 7 or 8 days, it's not always easy to open to the suffering that's there. You know, when you've been sitting in meditation and you begin to feel some pain in the body, do you say, "Oh, welcome. Let me feel you"? Probably that's not the first response, although maybe, we get there. And just as there are so many times when we don't want to open to our own suffering, there are many times that we just either don't feel the strength or there's the unwillingness to open to the suffering of others. There are very strong tendencies in the mind that keep us away from the feeling of suffering. Tendencies of denial, tendencies of apathy, tendencies of aversion to it, tendencies of indifference. So just as an experiment, watch the next time you approach a situation of suffering. It might be some pain in the body. It might be some difficult emotions that are arising, feelings of discontent, or fear, or shame, or loneliness, or unworthiness. Just different emotions that are painful. watch your mind as there's an approach to these kinds of suffering. It might be the interaction with a difficult person. It might be a situation of suffering in the world that we read about or see on the TV. What is the reaction in the mind when we first become aware of these situations of suffering? Do we feel uneasy about it? Do we withdraw in some way? Do we turn away? Do we distract ourselves? Or do we let it in? Do we really allow it to come close to us? I could see all of these different tendencies in my own mind in one very ordinary and simple situation in India when I was practicing in those years. For those of you who've been there, you know that there are lots of wild dogs in pitiful condition. You know, they're starving, their fur all mange, and just terrible, you know. And so often we might be sitting in a tea shop, just in the town, this was in Bodh Gaya, and these dogs would come up, you know, kind of whimpering for food. And it's very interesting just to watch the different reactions in my mind. Sometimes could really let in the suffering, the fact these were suffering beings, and, you know, would give it some food, and at other times, just let me enjoy my tea. You know, I didn't want to deal with it, I didn't want to see it. And it was so clear that in that unwillingness to open to the suffering, it closed the door of compassion. So there's this very close connection with our ability to stay open in all of these different situations and the possibility of compassionate response. So the big question for us is, can we keep our hearts open to the magnitude of suffering that's in the world? You know, there's a huge amount, and we, in some way, in these times, through the technology, in some way we're bombarded, you know, by the suffering, the images, and through the media. So is it even possible that we stay open in some way, you know, and diminish that tendency of indifference or not caring? This challenge is not a theoretical one, because it's not really enough to admire the qualities of love and compassion from a distance and to say, oh yes, these are good qualities, and maybe someday I'll cultivate them. And it's really not enough to think that the cultivation of them is limited to a special technique on a meditation retreat. Our practice in the deepest sense, the widest, broadest sense, is the transformation of our consciousness, you know, in all aspects of our lives, that makes compassionate responsiveness the default setting of our lives. You know, as we transform, we're in this process of purification, and gradually, you know, over time, step by step, we can approach a place where our hearts are mostly open. It won't be perfect, but it's more that becomes our natural way of being. The development of compassion and the possibility of it requires mindfulness, so that we are actually aware of the suffering that's present. It requires equanimity, so that we're not drowning in the suffering, we're not drowning in the sorrow. It's learning to simply be with things as they are, as they're presenting themselves. And this is the great gift of mindfulness to the development of compassion. Because as you know from this week, Mindfulness is the training to be with things as they are, both pleasant and unpleasant. So that's what you've been training in all this time, to be open. You've had this experience many times in this week of practicing opening to situations of suffering that are unpleasant. This is what makes compassion possible. What will become obvious, I think, as you leave here and go out into the world, and especially as you continue your practice, hopefully over many years, we begin to see that the greater our ability to open to our own suffering, the more courage we have to open to the suffering of others. Because we realize, yes, we can do this. We can be with the suffering without drowning, without being overwhelmed. So there is a Zen teacher in California. His name is Lou Richmond. And some years ago, he had a terrible disease. It's viral encephalitis, which is some kind of brain virus. It's often fatal. He was in a coma for weeks, spent years in recovery, and he's okay now. But he wrote about what he went through. And I just want to read a little excerpt from his book about the understanding that he developed through his illness. Because he had no way of escaping the suffering. He was in the suffering. And it was a long, long process. He said, sometimes when I'm asked to describe the Buddha's teaching, I say this: everything is connected, nothing lasts, you are not alone. This is really just a restatement of the traditional three marks of existence: non-self, everything is connected, impermanence, and suffering. I don't think I would have expressed the truth of suffering as you are not alone before my illnesses. But now I find that talking about it that way gets at something important. The fact that we all suffer means that we are all in the same boat. And that's what allows us to feel compassion. And I've really found that to be true, even on much less dramatic situation than his. But haven't you noticed that, just for example, if you have experienced a lot of back pain, then when somebody else is having back pain, isn't it easier just to feel compassion because you know it? You know the pain of it. And so there's just this natural connectedness. So the more we open to our own suffering, we realize you are not alone. No one is alone, because we all share in this. And this is the gateway, the doorway to compassion. So the beginning of compassion is empathy. And this happens when we take a moment to stop and feel what is going on in another person or with ourselves before rushing on in our lives. This stopping is really an important practice, because many times we may be cognizant that someone else is suffering, but often we don't even stop for a few moments to actually stop and allow ourselves to feel what they're feeling. We're so caught up in the momentum of our lives, it's like we kind of give a glance at the other person's suffering and then move on. So empathy is made possible if we just slow down a bit. When somebody else is expressing some kind of suffering, we just stop for a moment and let it in. Empathy is the heart mind of inclusion. Instead of exclusion, it includes everything. It takes others in. The other night I mentioned Ryokan, the Japanese monk, hermit, poet, the one with the moon at the window. He beautifully lived, as you read his writings and his poetry, he beautifully lived this quality of inclusion. And there's lots of stories of his just going around the mountain villages, playing with the village children, and just taking life in, even towards inanimate objects. So he wrote this wonderful little haiku poem. It's one of my favorites. I've forgotten my begging bowl, but no one would steal it. No one would steal it. How sad for my begging bowl. I love that. Compassion for his begging bowl, the fact that it's so poor and dented that nobody would even want it. So we can practice developing empathy in many different situations. It might be opening to the distress of the restless person sitting near you, instead of getting lost in aversion and reactivity because they're disturbing your meditation. But how often, somebody's restless or having difficulty making noise, what's our first reaction? Is it annoyance? Is it irritation? Or can we just open for a moment and realize, that's happening because they're in some kind of pain? So it's just this little thing. It might be, this empathy might be in the opening to the suffering of somebody we're close to, who's going through a really difficult time. Or to, a really stressful situation in the world. Empathy has the great power to take us out of our self-referential point of view. So instead of always referring everything back to a me, empathy opens us up. So this possibility is expressed with great incisiveness by the Zen master Bankai, who lived, I think it was 15th century or 16th century. There's a wonderful book of his teachings called The Unborn. And if you have a chance, it's a very good book. Anyway, there's one line in that book where he says, don't side with yourself. That's very good advice. Because our usual way of going through the world is siding with ourselves. We're always invested in our own point of view. And it's not that we shouldn't have a point of view, but can we hold it a little more lightly and realize that not everybody is going to see things the same way we do. And so this is like a move of empathy, where we're trying to understand things from other perspectives. We can develop empathy even in very intense situations. And there's one account by a Tibetan doctor. His name is Dr. Tenzin Chodrak. And many years ago, he was physician to the Dalai Lama. He was imprisoned by the Chinese for 17 years, tortured for many of those years. Finally, after all those years, he was released, came to the West, and he wrote an account of what enabled him to survive not only physically, but to survive with a heart that was still open and free of anger and hatred. So that's something to pay attention to, because he really lived through this intense suffering. So just a few of the points that he made in this article. He saw that the people who were torturing him, his enemies, were human beings, just like he was, who were also in adverse circumstances. Because he saw that the guards, they were in a situation where they were creating all of this unwholesome karma, which was going to lead to their own future suffering. So he saw the whole human predicament, and the commonality of the law of karma. But what's interesting, to me, it struck me, he didn't see the law of karma in this situation as a vehicle of revenge. It wasn't that he was thinking, oh, these people are going to get what they deserve. He understood the law of karma as a vehicle of compassion. Even as he was the recipient of all of this harm, he was able to connect with the commonality of this human predicament. So somebody wrote an article about Dr. Chodrak describing him. So I want to read this description of him because it captures a possibility. An appearance almost of timidity on first meeting, a voice so quiet it might be a whisper. Dr. Chodrak could easily pass unnoticed until you met his gaze. A gaze filled with the perception of one who has seen so much that he has seen everything, seeing beyond the suffering he's experienced, beyond all the evil and the abuses he has witnessed, yet expressing boundless compassion for his fellow human beings. So I find that remarkable, that this is a potential, even in these horrendous circumstances, that there is a potential of understanding in such a way that allows our heart to stay connected, to stay open. But this is a practice. This is not easy. Right? This is something that needs to be developed and cultivated. It's also important when we hear this to understand that in situation when it's possible to take action, to stop harm, compassion doesn't mean, we just let everything happen. When it's possible to take strong action to prevent harm, to prevent injustice, that we take those actions. But can we do it even when we're acting forcefully in response? Can we do it attentive to our own motivations? Are we doing it out of anger? Are we doing it out of hatred? Are we doing it out of resentment? Or are we doing it out of compassion for the suffering of the situation? So this is our work. And this is where mindfulness is such a gift to compassion. It allows us to examine and to be courageous enough to examine our own motivations. The great lesson here is that how we feel and what motivates us is up to us. Right? We don't have to have fantastic situations to have wholesome motivations. Even in very difficult situations, we can train our hearts. So just one example of this. You probably all know of Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the democracy movement in Burma. She was under house arrest, many, many years, 15 years or more. And many of her close colleagues were in prison and really suffering from the despotism of the military government in Burma. So finally, when she was allowed to go out and things opened up a little bit, she was having an interview with an Australian newspaper. And the reporter asked her, after all these years of being under house arrest and seeing all the suffering caused by the generals, they asked her, don't you want to bring these generals down? And she replied, no, I want to bring them up. That's quite a response. It wasn't revenge against the generals. How can I help enlighten them? How can I help awaken them? So empathy brings us close to suffering. Compassion takes us a step further. It's not only feeling what others are going through, which is empathy. Compassion is the motivation to act on that feeling. So Thich Nhat Hanh, he expressed this very well. He said, compassion is a verb, even though literally it's a noun. But he says compassion is a verb because what it means is that feeling that motivates us to act, to take action. So as compassion grows, we begin to take an active engagement with the world, responding to the various needs of beings in whatever way is appropriate, whatever way is possible. Sometimes we're acting in very small and unregarded ways. Maybe it's a small gesture of friendliness, of kindness, of generosity, forgiveness. We're just expressing in action this feeling of compassion. We shouldn't overlook these opportunities or underestimate their importance. Sometimes compassion takes the form of great courage. You think of people like, in the States, Martin Luther King Jr., who led these civil rights marches surrounded by crowds of people filled with violence and hatred, and his maintaining the quality of love. Or Nelson Mandela in South Africa. There's some extraordinary people, Gandhi. Sometimes courage manifests just in an ordinary person doing an extraordinary thing. So there was someone in New York some years ago who did something, he was called the subway hero. Subway is like the metro. So he was down in the subway and a woman had fallen on the tracks and a train was coming. So he jumped down on the tracks, laid down on top of her, and the train passed over both of them, and they were okay. So this is what he wrote. He got a lot of publicity about this. This is what he wrote. I don't feel like I did something spectacular. I just saw someone who needed help. I did what I felt was right. I do construction work in confined, tight spaces a lot. So I looked, and my judgment was pretty right. The train did have enough room for me. So just imagine that situation. I mean, how would we be? It would be horrifying. But just without thought, he saw the situation, he saw the potential for immense suffering, just in a moment, kind of the intuition that he could do something, and he did it. It's amazing. It's because his heart was open, and he had a good assessment of what he could do. So I just get really inspired by, the range of possible compassionate response. It's important, I think, that we understand there is no hierarchy to compassionate action. It's not that some forms of compassion are better than or higher than others. The field of compassion is limitless. It's the field of suffering beings. So we each find our own way with this. And we will each manifest compassion just according to our own abilities, our own interests. It's not that we have to do it like anybody else does it. But if we understand the importance and the value of this quality, then I think we stay more open to the possibilities of expressing it. Compassionate action can take the form of frontline engagement with the world in situations of real suffering. It could also take the form of sitting in a cave for years, alone, with the motivation to awaken for the benefit of all. That's as compassionate an action as being on the front lines of social engagement. Think of the Bodhisattva, the Buddha before his enlightenment. The stories, many, many lifetimes of his being a renunciate, going off, living alone, in a cave, cultivating all the qualities of a Buddha. But you can just imagine what people said, what's this guy doing? He's not helping anybody, he's just off meditating. And yet, as a fruit of all those lifetimes in practice, culminating in the great awakening and the great flowering of compassion from him, as a result of that awakening, we are here 2,600 years later because of what he did. So don't underestimate the range of how compassion is expressed. Sometimes it's very active, sometimes it's doing inner work. This again is from the Dalai Lama. Changes in attitude never come easily. The development of love and compassion is a wide round curve that can be negotiated only slowly, not a sharp corner that can be turned all at once. It comes with daily practice. So that's an important message. As we hear about and understand the possibility of these very beautiful qualities, we have to have a great humility in undertaking the development of them. It's not an instant affair. And the reason it's not an instant affair is because we are who we are. And we need to have humility about, this is a big thing, and it's going to take time. And we have to be patient and persevering. Each of us can plant the seeds of a compassionate heart within us. And the more we practice, slowly the seeds germinate and grow and flourish. And even in times when we're not acting from a loving place, or we're not acting from a compassionate place, they can still be the reference point. These qualities can be the reference point that reminds us of other possibilities. So it's not that we should have the expectation, oh yes, I've read about this, I've practiced a little bit, and from now on, I'm going to be this totally warm and loving and compassionate person. If it happens, great, but it's probably unlikely. But even still, there's a power in remembering the value of it. So even when we get caught up in our old patterns, it's the reminder, there's another possibility here. And that really changes the way we live. So I'd just like to close with a teaching from Mingyur Rinpoche, who's a young Tibetan Lama, very very wise, very beautiful, very extraordinary, really. In recent years, he started teaching all over the world. He set up a worldwide network of centers and sanghas and students. And he's young. He's quite young, probably in his early 30s. And in the midst, so everything was just taking off, big worldwide scene. He announced that he was going off, leaving it all, to wander in the mountains of India, Nepal, and Tibet. In the tradition of the great Tibetan yogis, he left everything. He dropped everything. He arranged for it to carry on in his absence. It's been 3 years. Rumor is that he's coming back soon. So this is just that's his dedication. Just an expression of his dedication to practice and to awakening. He wasn't seduced by the whole scene that he had created. So this is what he wrote, and it's really beautiful. The best part of all is that no matter how long you meditate, or what technique you use, every technique of Buddhist meditation ultimately generates compassion, whether we're aware of it or not. Whenever you look at your mind, you can't help but recognize your similarity to those around you. When you see your own desire to be happy, you can't avoid seeing the same wish in others. And when you look clearly at your own fear, anger, or aversion, you can't help but see that everyone around you feels the same fear and anger and aversion. When you look at your own mind, all the imaginary differences between yourself and others automatically dissolve. And this is really true. When we understand our own minds, we understand everybody's minds, because they're the same. When you look at your own mind, all the imaginary differences between yourself and others automatically dissolve, and the ancient prayer of the four immeasurables, the four Brahma Viharas, becomes as natural and persistent as your own heartbeat. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and free from the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings have joy and the causes of joy. And may all sentient beings remain in great equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. When you look at your own mind, all the imaginary differences between yourself and others automatically dissolve. And this ancient prayer, the four Brahma Viharas, become as natural and persistent as your own heartbeat. So this is our practice. This is what we're cultivating together. So let's sit quietly for a few minutes.
So when we follow Munindra-ji's advice and sit down and look into our minds, the first kind of insight is, of course, the wandering mind, that we really don't exercise 100% control over our attention. And although this is not really an insight into no self, it's a pointer to in that direction. It's interesting, we don't exercise 100% control. We don't, that characteristic, we should demand of a self that it exercises sovereignty over itself, but it's not yet the insight into no self. And I know many of you have problems with understanding no self. You cannot understand it theoretically. It is something you have to understand on the inside level in Vipassana. And the first insight is the insight into impermanence. As Munindra-ji told us, the whole of the Buddhist teaching will unfold itself to us if we just persevere in our practice of sitting down and looking into ourselves. We will develop insight into, to an increasing extent, into dukkha, potential suffering, in the context of our life story. After a while, the whole surface content of the everyday consciousness disappears, all the thoughts about the last 2 weeks, and we get down to memories will surface. Memories most of us have been out of contact with, or not in contact with in general, will surface. The story of ourselves will surface. And we'll begin to understand dukkha, suffering, in the context of that story. And we begin to understand as the insight into impermanence and suffering, potential suffering and actualized suffering, as those insights deepen, we begin to understand no self or no core self. So just be patient. And until you understand no self, it's perfectly all right to believe that you are yourself. Just be mindful of it's just a thought. Just be mindful of your thoughts. And of course, an accelerating factor is the development of concentration, of one-pointedness of mind. And in Vipassana we're continuing our development of concentration, but not so much primarily on one object, but on the insight into impermanence, on the insight in rise and fall. And because there are many objects, actually one of the names, one of the not so well-known names of Vipassana is actually a manifoldness of seeing into. Vipassana means that as well as a clear seeing into. A manifoldness of seeing into, because there's a multitude of objects. All the objects at the doors of the perceptions are objects of insight. And as we go on developing concentration, the dhyanic factors manifest themselves. The dhyanic factors, as I mentioned, these 5 factors, I don't know if you remember them, initial application of the mind, focusing, sustaining of awareness in that focus, a keen interest and rapture, and acquired contented joy, sukha, together with mental one-pointedness. These factors are the template of all so-called beautiful consciousness. And there are many, in the samatha meditations, we really cultivate them to a very high degree. In Vipassana, we cultivate them in a different constellation with mindfulness. But they manifest themselves, and as you become more and more concentrated, you will experience some of the peculiar effects of piti and sukha. Piti, strong interest, will manifest itself as rapture, even rapture. It's very physical rapture, like goose flesh, for instance, or tremors in the limbs, which are very pleasurable. It's almost like an ecstasy. And maybe some of you have experienced that it is as if you levitate, as if your body is lifting up from the cushion. And you'll experience deep calm, clear inside you. After a while you'll see not only the rising phase but also the falling phase. And you will experience deep calm and deep faith in the Dharma. You're very excited about being in this retreat and want to devote your whole life to doing Vipassana meditation. And that's all very nice. And in the beginning it's okay to enjoy it. It's unusual. It's very nice. And they are actually the manifestation of these 5 dhyanic factors, which have sort of make the meditation one-sided, a little one-sided. There's not enough sufficiently mindfulness to balance the dhyanic factors. So they actually begin to block the inside. They become corruptions of inside. You can also experience strong light. I know some of you experienced that already, of the color of orange light or white light, and it can be very powerful. It can be just a glimpse, or it can be very powerful. And after a while, after you have enjoyed it, you have to detect the momentariness in these experiences as well. And it can be a little frustrating to sit there with in a huge light and then begin with the mentioning very humble notes, seeing. But it's very effective to sort of create this stepping stone for the mind to withdraw a little bit from this experience, or no matter how overwhelming it appears, just to disidentify the mind from the light, which is just another object of the mind. And as it arises the next time, try to be with the arising phase of it. And try to, while you're in it, try to detect, to any degree, it's turning into otherwiseness. It's variability, it's changeability. And when you succeed in this, the light disappears, the rapture disappears, also that wonderful tranquility, which some people mistake to be enlightenment, disappears. It is impermanent, everything is impermanent. And you have to understand this at that stage. This is actually the very beginning of Vipassana. And most people, when they get there, they think that's the end of Vipassana. Now I know everything. But it's just the beginning. And it's wonderful, of course, that it is so enjoyable. And you become very motivated to continue your practice, to deepen your practice. The level of concentration on which all this happens is called momentary concentration, Khanika Samadhi. If you do just samatha, that level of concentration is called access concentration, or neighborhood concentration, upachara samadhi, because it's close to the actual jhanic absorption. But because we develop concentration on a multitude of objects, and so to speak, repeat the act of concentration from object to object, it has this name momentary concentration. But it has the same strength as access concentration. And the criterion for this strength is that is a state of concentration which cannot be invaded by a hindrance. Your mind does not wander in that state. And in the beginning it lasts for just one moment. That's why it has this name. So there's the strong manifestation of vitakka, initial application, focusing, vichara, sustained application, and then maybe that concentrated awareness falls away. Then you have to repeat it. Focusing, sustaining, and then it falls away, refocusing, sustaining. And as you become more and more skilled in this, the period of sustained awareness grows, expands. And you could be in a state of Vichara Samadhi for hours. No hindrances. Your mind does not wander. And your insight is very, very clear, very, very lucid. And at this stage, when your concentration has deepened to a certain extent, all these corruptions, they arise. And then you have to meditate on them the way I just explained. Some of you are experienced meditators, you have experienced some of this before, or you're just about to experience it because you've been on several retreats before this one. And for some of you, this is the first retreat, and maybe you're just beginning to experience this, or you haven't experienced it yet, but you'll experience it maybe at home. So usually it's not really good to be informed about all these things if you have not experienced them, because then you will sit and expect them and think about them. But because this retreat is very short and you'll go home and you'll be on your own, it's good to be informed about this experiences on the path. And as our concentration develops, we also experience to an increasing degree some unpleasant side effects of concentration development. And I know most of you have experienced this already. I have called them the unbalance of the simple elements. Earth element is out of balance with air element and fire element, and these unbalances can also be understood as phantom tensions in the nervous system. And those of you who were stressed when you came here have experienced them to a very extensive degree. Some other strange experiences are that all of a sudden it's as if your hand grows, and speak as a football, or your head grows. Some of you have had this experience as well. Your head grows, your body grows, and then all of a sudden it shrinks and becomes tiny, tiny, tiny. It's as if it disappears completely. The modern explanation of that could be that your nervous system is not used to process the sense of your body in a state of deep meditation. It has to get used to it. You're doing something very unusual, something you've never done before in your life. You're sitting immobile for a very long period of times, as immobile as you are in deep sleep, but in deep sleep you're not concentrated and aware. You're very aware and concentrated in this state of meditative immobility. So the nervous system has to learn how to process the sense of your body, and it takes some time. So all of a sudden it is as if the body is huge, and then it is as if the body is tiny, and then it is as if one arm grows, and then it's like a leg grows. How many of you have had experiences like that? Yeah, quite a few. Yeah, sure. Don't worry. Try to catch the rising phase of the phenomenon every time it appears. The procedure to overcome these effects, or is the same as in relation to all other objects. Try to disidentify from them. Don't. When you feed them, you identify with them. You react on them. You maybe get afraid, or you try to push the experience away. Then you feed it. Then it takes longer time before your nervous system, so to speak, is normalized. So just accept, and you could make a mental note. So when your hand is growing. Use the mental notes as stepping stones for the mind to step out of the entanglement with the object. Be careful that you breathe in a relaxed way, because you cannot be relaxed if you don't breathe in a relaxed way. And the relaxed way to breathe is breathing at the level the abdomen. So you just go on practicing as your practice is right now. Be aware of the impermanence as much as you can. If you feel overwhelmed, go down to the breathing, collect your mind, and then go back to choiceless awareness when you feel you're ready. Enjoy the enjoyable aspects of the meditation, but without clinging, without identifying. Don't condemn the unpleasant effects of the meditation. Just observe, then the unpleasant side effects vanishes sooner. Be prepared that these pleasant side effects and the unpleasant side effects can last pretty long time. You know, the stage you are entering takes a long time. And it is the learning stage of Vipassana. So be patient. Be patient.